Good morning. My name is Professor Jeff Korn. I teach in Houston, Texas, and I too would like to thank Daphné and Bill Banks for inviting me once again to participate in this great event. I just want to give you a little introduction to the phase we're about to enter into. About a year ago when I was here at the end of the last event, Daphné came to me and asked or suggested that we try and come up with some method to highlight not just the legal complexity of applying international humanitarian law or the law of armed conflict to operations, but the operational complexity. And this has been an area of the study of this law that's been very significant to me, is to help people understand that what we're talking about here is not a fancy legal debate, but is a body of norms that have to be implemented by commanders who have an obligation to engage in hostilities, which is a brutal business. And so Daphné and I came up with this idea of thinking of some key concepts and then trying to illustrate the application of these concepts through a very simple, even though there's no such thing as simple, operational scenario, and then to invite not only experts in the law per se, but also experts in the application of the law. And for me personally, the most significant event in my recognition of why it's important to understand these different perspectives was the Gotovina case that Lieutenant Colonel DeCock spoke about, because I was involved in that case as a defense expert, and candidly I was stunned by some of what I thought was the lack of understanding of the challenge of an operational commander in executing a military operation and how that influences the way the law is interpreted, applied, and critiqued. And so we came up with this idea of doing a scenario. Now, some of you, hopefully you've had a chance to look through the scenario, and some of you may be wondering, if we're in a conference on counterterrorism law, why are we talking about what appears to be a relatively conventional conflict? Well, that was very deliberate, because what we thought was, if we can identify areas of consensus and divergence in an operational context that is as relatively clear as two uniform belligerent forces fighting each other in an interstate conflict, then it will tell us that that complexity will become even more significant as the nature of the conflict becomes increasingly complex. And I know that General Barbero is going to refer to that in his opening remarks. So you've already had the introductions for two of our speakers. Let me give you a brief introduction of General Barbero, and first say that when we speak of an honor to be introducing somebody, this is really a special honor for me, because when I first started as a JAG, Lieutenant General Barbero was then Lieutenant Colonel Barbero, had just taken command of a unit called the Iron Rockasons, the 3rd Battalion of the 187th Infantry of the 101st Airborne Division, and I was his lawyer. He was really the commander that gave me my introduction in being a legal advisor to a operational infantry commander. And what I learned in that 2-year period, I can't even quantify it. So it is such an honor to have him here with us, I believe, but a special honor for me to be able to introduce him. And I extend the same compliment to my dear friend Rich Whitaker, who was my first boss when I went to work for Colonel Barbero as a JAG. Lieutenant General Michael Barbero has recently retired from the Army after serving 38 years of active duty. He was commissioned in the infantry branch upon graduation from the U.S. Military Academy at West Point in 1976. Lieutenant General Barbero served in a variety of tactical assignments in mechanized light and air assault infantry units, and has commanded at every grade from lieutenant colonel to lieutenant general. Lieutenant General Barbero served nearly 4 years in Iraq, over 3 separate combat tours, and participated in the invasion of Panama in 1989. He also commanded the Battle Command Training Program, the Joint Readiness Training Program at Fort Polk, Louisiana, where Colonel Whitaker used to go to train those commanders. Those were all that training was conducted under General Barbero's command and leadership. I could spend the whole hour giving you accolades about him, but I'll let him impress you for himself. Thank you, sir.
Thanks, Jeff. Thank you. Well, thanks, Jeff. Thank you very much. It's an honor to be here. I mean that. And when Jeff reached out and invited me and gave me this opportunity. Given my enormous respect for him, I seized upon it. What I'm going to give you is the view of an operational commander. And we've had a theoretical discussion about the rule of IHL, the law of warfare. I'd like to give you an operational perspective. I call it the new reality of asymmetric warfare and taking the theoretical into the practical. And some of the concepts we discussed, frankly, are interesting, but I'm not sure how relevant they are. Someone said this morning the rules of IHL must be practical. I would tell you they must be relevant. And there's a tension. There's a tension within my profession about do we go back and design forces for what we want and what we seek, these great maneuver, force-on-force, clearly linear war battlefields, or do we incorporate what we've learned in the last 10 years as we design these forces? I would say for the legal profession and IHL, you should be asking the same questions. As far as conventional warfare, conventional operations, destroying a particular target is a complicated but solvable problem of physics. Defeating an adversary or a formal unit is a more complex but a well-studied question of military art. Destroying an adversary or a formal unit is a problem of physics and will applied over time. It's a question of endurance. However, in today's asymmetric warfare or nonlinear battlefields, operating within or controlling a population is massively more complex. To anticipate the reactions of an entire society or even understanding what's taking place before it's too late is the challenge. It's a challenge of intelligence, patience, understanding of culture and society, and the precise application of the aforementioned physics. But the use of force is still the currency in this enterprise, make no mistake. And here is where art meets science. And also you must combine in the unconventional factors of the impact of social media that is being used as their command and control network. So one of the questions is here about a command and control network or node. We invest millions of dollars in building theirs. Theirs is on a handheld device and social media. So how do you target that? And I've witnessed this done well. I've witnessed it done badly. But it's not a black and white issue as we've talked about this morning. What's a civilian target? What's proportion? What's a human shield in the age of suicide bombers? What is surrender? And how do you deal with these issues? As one commander told me, he said, "Sir, it's not civilians on the battlefield. Civilians are the battlefield." So they're not separate and clearly identifiable entities. To treat civilians in warfare, current warfare, it's asymmetric warfare, as such, is unrealistic. The failure to understand this human factor has been our U.S. military's greatest shortcoming in the past decade of war. Especially, I saw it in my first year in the opening of operations in Iraq. We failed to understand how this human dynamic worked and how we could use it to our advantage. So my profession is at a critical crossroads. How do we incorporate the human factors of any current or future operations in shaping our training, our leader development, and even the design of our forces? And how do we shape that in how we apply operational law? Even when you think it's a fairly clean-cut operation, there will be this factor on the battlefield. So it's a huge challenge for an army that still idolizes the heroes of World War II and large maneuver and conventional forces. And from the discussion this morning, I think it's a huge challenge for this profession also. How do you move from the theoretical, linear discussion that we've been having to one of an asymmetric, insurgent, militia, irregular battlefield? So as I tell my leaders in my profession, as guerrillas, terrorists, and hybrid adversaries wage a war among the people, on fast forward with cell phones, social media, and the global internet, we cannot revert to a focus on big guns and big armies. And for our legal concepts in discussion, we cannot revert to a focus on conventional terms attack, military objectives, conventional weapons, military belligerents, warnings, capture versus kill, in a world of suicide bombers, IEDs, militias, etc. So on this new battlefield of asymmetric operations, war among the population, to expect a commander to surrender tactical advantage for the concept for and surrender force protection, or by shaping an operation merely to try to seek to capture one of these terrorists or suicide bombers is not relevant. We teach our commanders, and it's still, even on this new battlefield, it's still a question and a challenge of gaining the tactical advantage, never surrendering the initiative, driving the tempo, and accomplishing the mission, first and foremost, with minimum losses to your forces, minimum damage, and minimum civilian casualties, but accomplishing the mission nonetheless. So the scenario should raise the questions about the discriminate versus indiscriminate use of force. What are feasible precautions? But I would be remiss if we did not talk about this human nature of the current battlefield we're in. So I'd ask the question, how does operational law merge with the existing legal framework, which I think is still designed for conventional force on force? How do we adjust IHL, the rule of law, operational law, to deal with this asymmetric, nonlinear battlefield that we've faced for the last decade and which we'll continue to face? With that, I'll leave it with that question. Thank you.
Well, thanks for the final question, because really I think that's been the focus of this entire project that was generated by Bill Banks several years ago. And as Bill indicates, there have already been a couple of books published that have made an effort to try and answer this question. But from the earlier presentation, I took a couple of notes, and one of them referenced the comments by Professor Sassuli that you can't just say that it's complicated, right? There are complications and uncertainties in all bodies of law, but in this body of law, there has to be some touchstone of analysis provided, because this is the commander who has to execute the mission. These are the legal advisors who have to sit in the planning process and say, yes, it's lawful, no, it's not lawful. So to simply say, well, deciding what's excessive is complicated, or it's a case-by-case question, or what's feasible is complicated, that might be an interesting discussion, but it doesn't advance the analysis of what is or is not legitimate. And so the idea was to use this scenario, and basically the scenario is very simple. It is a force-on-force battle, but what's not simple is what the commander has to do now. The commander has to launch an offensive operation that's going to require gaining control of a vital military objective, a bridge. The enemy knows it's a vital military objective. They haven't destroyed it because they want to preserve it for their own ability to continue the attack in the opposite direction. And in order to do this, the commander is going to have to put some of his own forces in grave danger, both in the bridge crossing operation and also in the operation to shape or prepare the battlefield through a helicopter assault deep behind enemy lines with rotary wing assets that are extremely vulnerable to enemy air defense. And make no mistake about it, the enemy commander knows exactly how vulnerable that bridge is as well, and he also knows what the capabilities of our commander are. So you can assume that he's preparing to do everything possible to disrupt any effort to take that bridge. And through some of these questions, what we're hoping to do, is to generate some discussion on where the pragmatic and the theoretical either meet or diverge. And that's all we're trying to do, is look for areas of consensus and divergence using a very conventional operation that highlights exactly what Colonel Whitaker said. There's nothing called a simple combat operation. There's nothing simple about fighting either an asymmetric threat or a symmetric threat. So I had listed kind of two main focuses of the operation and some questions under them, and I'm just going to throw them out to the different speakers. The first is the execution of this what we call an air assault, this helicopter assault behind enemy lines in order to disrupt or block the ability of enemy forces to bring reinforcements up to this bridgehead to support the main effort, which will be to take the bridge. And the first question I asked was, we talk about feasible precautions, but in this mission, what precautions would you consider taking? What might you take? What would you advise taking? So we know the basic question is this assault. I'm going to start with Colonel Whitaker, because one thing that Colonel Whitaker and General Barbero do have in common is they both served in our premier helicopter assault unit, which is the 101st Airborne Division. So, I mean, this is the lifeblood of that organization, is planning for these type of operations. So, Rich, what are your concerns when the commander or one of the planners asks you, do we have to take precautions? And if so, what does that mean, and what type of risk do we have to assume to do it?
Okay, my instinctual first reaction to the question, as Jeff just posed it, assuming that my commander or any one of the operational planners, any one of those officers or non-commissioned officers within a planning operational center would come to me and ask me the question, do we have to take precautions? I would tell you that would never happen. That would never happen, because they would automatically want to reduce their training and experience and just who they are. They would always want to reduce and mitigate any civilian harm. But they would also, as the general said, they're also focused on mission accomplishment, because that's who they are. That's also who they are. So they're internally balancing this. So they would come and probably ask me, what is legally required? Here's what we're thinking about doing. But in my experience, in every instance, they've already integrated some form of mitigation that probably at least satisfies the law into their operational planning. In terms of this, suppression of enemy air defense, you have to think about, okay, the type of aircraft we're talking about. It's a rotary wing aircraft, very deadly aircraft. Attack helicopters and cargo helicopters, et cetera, but they're very vulnerable to air defense. And so that's one of your most effective combat multipliers. You want to protect it. It's very essential to mission accomplishment. So you've got to eliminate the air defense capability of the enemy. If that capability, enemy capability, is in the proximity to the civilians, then of course you're automatically integrating mitigation methods.
Well, let me make it a little harder for you. We know the enemy is not going to put its ADA assets out in the middle of an open field. They're going to use the civilian population centers to cloak them in an effort to degrade your capability. So make that an assumption.
In this scenario, I think it's obvious to the enemy that we're going to go after their air defense. There's no sneak attack. It might be they know we're coming, they just don't know when we're coming. So we could probably warn, because they know we're coming. So we're not giving up the element of surprise. We're not giving up anything. So we would probably, in this situation, warn the civilians to get out of this vicinity, and then we would also probably give them a reasonable opportunity to evacuate once we've issued that warning.
So let me put that to the commander now. So you're in the targeting cell, the planning cell. That's what your staff judge advocate, your operational lawyer is recommending. What's your instinct on dropping leaflets that, hey, we're coming, get out of the way?
And you're going to do everything you can to minimize your casualty and accomplish the mission. So if that facilitates targeting these, allowing you to target them, then I would consider leaflets or some sort of general announcement to move out with. It wouldn't be precise, it wouldn't be predictive of when we're going to attack, but if that's the perspective I have, is how can I minimize my casualties, my losses, and that is a prime consideration, and how am I going to do my mission? And then secondly, if they persist in placing them in these civilian areas, well, what are some other ways to neutralize these assets? Is it very centralized command? Oh, okay. Does not? Okay. What are some other ways rather than kinetically striking these air defense weapons? Can you go after the command and control? If it's a very centralized process, then how can you knock out their communications? But at the end of the day, you're going to do what you have to do. after you've taken some prudent steps to minimize your casualties and accomplish the mission.
So that selection process of your planners give you define the objective,
right,
which is to suppress the enemy air defense. Right. Then the experts on your staff give you the different methods that they think could achieve it, and you go through as the commander and say, this is the one that I think poses the greatest likelihood of success with limited risk. Do you see that instinctively as a law of war analysis, or do you see that instinctively as an operational analysis?
For me, it's an operational analysis, balancing risks and how much risk am I willing to tolerate. And if it's an if the advice from my legal advisor is certain things about targeting, I'm going to take that in consideration. It's not going to rule the day. I have to balance risk against the golden metric of mission accomplishment.
So, Chris, let me throw one on you now. I mean, you're the air officer, and you're used to working with air assets. So one of the questions that I stuck in there was the question of unobserved indirect fires, right? So just to make this real simple, you know where the enemy air defense is. You think you do. Some of it you know, but some of it you might not know. But you know what your air route is, and you know from intelligence where the enemy would ideally put its air defense capability. Would there ever be a situation where you think you would advise a commander to fire based just on intelligence templating, suppression of air defense?
Well, I would not rule it out in the first place. And again, what the general said and what Colonel Whitaker said, I mean, I agree. Military advantage. I mean, targeting process as such, that is a process that is owned by the operators. Legal advisors must be aware that this is not only a legal game based on the law of war, because basically the military commander, he has a military end state to achieve, and the way he will assess the military advantage of taking out these air defense systems, of course, will be based on I would say the operational planning process that will lead to, and the aim is of course not to summarize here how the OPP works, but the military advantage that is defined by the operational commander is linked to decisive points within this operational planning process that leads us to the alliance to accomplish the military mission and what the strategic end state is.
But you would agree, wouldn't you, that suppressing that air defense for this attack is about as decisive
Of course. I mean, even if I just have a close look at what we did in Unified Protector, that was basically the first step of the first phase is basically suppression of enemy air defense. Because basically what you want is to acquire be it air superiority or air supremacy, not for the sake of having air superiority or air supremacy, but in order to allow the other components as well to achieve the mission they are assigned to. So that would be, I would even say that this suppression of enemy air defense would, in the balance of proportionality that we will probably come on later on this one, is crucial for the success of the mission.
Well, I was going to say, if you're going to do this type of operation, it's an essential precondition. Otherwise, the risk is too high, and you wouldn't conduct the operation. It's essential to be able to do this.
So you would not rule out the use of what some people might call blind fires, templated fires?
I would not rule it out. I'd have to look at it and where it was and ensure it was proportionate. But you have precise, you have known targets, and then you take a look how their doctrine arrays their air defense weapons, and you template where they are, and you could very well have them targeted, maybe on call at a senior commander's authority to strike purely templated targets. But certainly you'd have to factor those in.
Rich, how would you feel if you saw that proposed?
I would question it. I mean, I agree with the general that you wouldn't rule that out. You wouldn't rule anything out that serves mission accomplishment. However, I think the general would probably agree that having been at JRTC and me at BCTP, the two training centers that train commanders and staff officers, to perform this process, we always are suspect of unobserved fires. Unobserved fires can be very detrimental to mission accomplishment because you can cause damage that then you have to work to make up from. So if there's an observed fire alternative, you would always select that first. And then I think what the commander might ask, why do I have to use templated fires, unobserved, or blind fires? Isn't there an alternative to that?
So let me try and take this now into the asymmetrical context that General Barbero started talking about. There's been a lot of criticism in the legal community of what some people call signature strikes, right? That the United States is attacking what they believe are terrorist belligerent leadership or operatives based on intelligence signatures. And it gets to the point that was raised by the first speaker, which is when you are defining a military objective, how certain must you be that what you're attacking is in fact a military objective? And I think whether we're talking about a signature strike of a terrorist belligerent leader or unobserved suppression of enemy air defense based on intelligence analysis, you've implicated the same question. How certain does the law require the commander to be, Rich, in his determination that what he is going to put that kinetic weapon on is in fact a lawful military objective?
Thank you.
Chris?
No, I'll take a stab at that.
Well, I think we all should take a stab.
That's kind of the wedding party question that where, remember, in both Iraq and Afghanistan, U.S. forces or coalition forces have been accused of striking civilian targets, wedding parties. They're going through the desert, caravans of vehicles that are reported through intelligence to be bad guys, enemy. And and then the allegation later on is that they were not. They were, it was a wedding party. You just blew up a wedding party. They were civilian persons entitled to protection. They were never the enemy combatants, and you just hit the wrong target. Although it was the target you were aiming at. And so, that is very difficult. Of course, no one wants that to happen because, again, that is a strategic blunder. That's not just a tactical blunder; it's a strategic blunder. And it's very difficult to again come back from. So the answer to your question, there's no way to reduce this to any type of mathematical certainty. Based on this degree of confidence, we assess that this is an enemy presence, and that this enemy presence has this exact mathematical value, and so then we can perform the balancing test on that.
But
that is kind of the goal.
But before we even get to the balancing test, you got to start by saying it's a lawful object of attack.
Right.
Sir, you wanted to comment?
Well, I was just going to say, my experience, I spent 17 months as General Petraeus' operations officer in Baghdad during 2007, 2008. And it was a tough period then. And what we would do is, in conjunction with the legal team, is compile a list of these people were combatants. And we compiled the evidence, had it vetted, and sent it to General Petraeus for his approval. And they were on our killer capture list. And then we also specified which level of command had the authority to strike or conduct this operation. And this is an environment of fleeting targets, and the last thing you want is to put, not the last thing, but you're never going to put your troops or commander in risk. You want to give them as much flexibility as possible. And you always want to capture, not because of some rule of law, but because it is about understanding and attacking the network. The only way you understand the network is by intelligence, by capturing individuals. So the first choice is to capture, but at the end of the day, it's the application of force. And so we had this list, and if we had intelligence that this individual was in a vehicle, in a building, or at a location, then if we had the ability to move in and capture him, and we balanced that risk and thought it was feasible, we'd do that. If not, then it was a bad day for him.
So, but when you say that capture was always the preference, do you see that a distinction between capture as a legal obligation versus capture as an operational advantage?
It was capture as an operational advantage in order to glean additional intelligence on the network.
Okay.
The only way you could understand, it was a fight for intelligence, is the way I saw it.
So, Chris, I know that you advised the Belgian paratrooper unit in Afghanistan. So let me ask you the question. If I were the commander of that unit and my intelligence officer came to me and said, here are the indicators that indicate this individual is an enemy belligerent, and I came to you and said, how certain do I have to be? I mean, do I have to think it's more likely than not? Do I have to have no doubt? Because there was some discussion earlier that if there's any doubt, if we look at Protocol 1, if there's any doubt whether it's a civilian or a combatant, it has to be you have to err in favor of side of civilian. So as a commander, what do you tell me in terms of how satisfied I have to be with the evidence that this is in fact an enemy belligerent?
Well, I would argue that the standard is on PID, on positive identification, is the reasonable certainty that geographically or geospatially object or person is indeed a military objective, be it an enemy combatant or a DPHer or a military objective according to the definition of a military objective. So that would be the reasonable certainty. Now, coming back on the asymmetric warfare and counterinsurgency, of course, the difficulty there is not the legal rule as such. General referred to, and I completely agree on a list, and that's basically the discussion we had on DPH, where we have basically this status-based targeting. The problem here is not the legal rule as such, but how to implement the rule. And what are the other factors that you will take into consideration to make that assessment, be it ICOM chatter, whatever the intelligence resources are. But at the end of the day, if the commander is satisfied that there is a reasonable certainty that this person is engaging in DPH or is an enemy belligerent or an enemy combatant, I would, as a legal advisor, approve the strike. But again,
but I mean, to push you a little, what does reasonable certainty mean? And you brought up the Gotovina case. I'll just use as an illustration. One of the questions, as you know, in Gotovina was, were the objects he was attacking lawful military objectives? And what really struck me in that process was there was no consensus on how certain he had to be that the Tvik factory, which made detonators, was in fact a lawful military objective. Was it? I think, candidly, I think there were a number of different interpreters. There was the court's interpretation, the defense interpretation, the prosecutor's interpretation, and his interpretation. But if I'm your commander, you say I have to be reasonably certain. Quantify that for me. What does that mean?
Well, it's difficult to quantify. It will depend on the reliability of the sources and what exactly the intelligence as such is, its quality and quantity.
And contextual, correct?
Of course. And that's basically, you will make and the commander will make an assessment based on what's in the intel summary sheet, at least if he has time in pre-planned operations to consult the intel summary sheet. But again, I mean, you refer to Gotovina, which is basically an example, a counter-example of how not to proceed, be it in relation to the 200-meter rules.
Well, but my point is, I in a sense felt sorry for Gotovina because he was told by his advisors, you're not allowed to attack it unless it's a military objective. But nobody told him how certain he had to be that it was a military objective before he attacked it. And so And I know it may not be quantifiable. The contextual piece, I think, is important, right? That's the connection, I think, between the unobserved indirect fire based on intelligence templating, where you've got clear doctrine of what the enemy is going to do. So that gives the commander some degree of certainty that where he's firing will, in fact, be a target, even if he doesn't have eyes on it, versus the asymmetrical fight where what you need to be certain changes. Would you agree, sir?
Right, I would agree. And in the asymmetric fight, the principle that I operated under was that the goal of a counterinsurgency is to neutralize, and that's the operative term, insurgents faster than they can be created. Neutralize. If you can neutralize that insurgent by turning the population against him, that's desirable. If you can capture him, if you can kill him, if you have to, that's neutralizing. It's not always killing. It's what can you do to neutralize him faster than they can be created. If he's in a densely populated area and you drop a 500-pound bomb where you think he is, you're creating more insurgents than you've destroyed. So it's counterproductive. So I think the way I look at it, it's the merging of operational law and military expediency. How do you accomplish this mission in a counterinsurgency and defeat them without creating more insurgents? You could.
I think what strikes me about that last comment is it sounds to me that you're suggesting there should be a logical symmetry between the rules of restraint that come from the law and the restraint that a commander will instinctively apply in combat to facilitate the overall objective of the mission.
I think the rule of law has veered into operational and mission accomplishment. Yeah, I mean, in this case, there is a symmetry. You're going to limit casualties because it's about the populations. It's about civilians are the battlefield, as I said, not just a factor on the battlefield.
I'd like to switch the focus a little bit and go to this question of concrete and direct when we're assessing military advantage. So we know that if we're going to do this bridge crossing, we anticipate the enemy's going to use some of these apartment complexes as vantage points for anti-armor hunter-killer teams. Is there a concrete and direct military advantage to using harassing artillery fire against those buildings generally? Or would you tell the commander you have to know precisely which apartment window is being used as a potential spotting point? Did you want to start, sir?
Yeah, in all operations, and certainly in this scenario, a commander would say, these are the types of targets that I reserve the right to approve. And these are the conditions that I reserve as the senior commander the right to approve. And he can further delegate to engage with artillery fire in a built-up area that requires a brigade commander, battalion commander, or whatever to approve that. So that's some way to
precaution.
The precaution.
So the level of command judgment that is permitted to make a difficult decision is in fact a precautionary measure that you're imposing as the senior commander.
Right, absolutely. It happens all the time.
And that's based on the assumption that the higher level of command, the higher the quality of judgment and staff work?
Right, and again, it is a judgment, you understand, but it's got to be balanced with freedom of action and not restricting the initiative of your subordinates. So you can't reserve every target at the highest level. You've got to be very selective and then trust your subordinates to do the right thing based on their training, experience, and your knowledge of them.
So, Chris, that question really did kind of come right out of Gotovina. You think the enemy's going to be using an apartment building. Is the apartment building itself a concrete and direct military advantage, or do you have to isolate down to the spot where they're going to be spotting from?
That's a tricky one. Thank you for that. Well, let me first come back, because basically this target engagement authority is basically one of the precautionary measures, where based on the complexity of the target and also in relation to collateral damage and the different levels of collateral damage, you would probably restrict the possibility for lower commanders to authorize a strike.
Well, what I find really fascinating about that is I think that's an area where operational practice is way ahead of the law. Because if you study, when you think of precautionary measures, you think of warning, evacuation, et cetera, but the staff planning process and the level of command judgment is a very common aspect of commanders' self-imposed limitations, but it's not naturally from the, maybe I'm wrong, but I think from the scholarly perspective, that's not instinctually viewed as an important precautionary measure.
In this case, what I could see very easily happening is a commander says, listen, you're restricted from using indirect fires in populated areas, with the exception of airbursts, for use a term, because the assumption is there are not going to be too many civilians out on the rooftops or balconies watching this happen. There'll be spotters and observers and enemy forces. So any commander can use that type of weapon, but you cannot use high explosives within populated areas. We're going to maximize the use of smoke, but I will reserve the right to employ a precision munition at the right time and place, and that's either my call or I've delegated it down to a certain level. So that's kind of the operational guidance that would ensure that you're prudent precaution balanced with risk.
So all consensus that kind of restricting subordinate command authority for use of certain weapon systems or tactics is in fact an important precautionary measure in contemporary operations?
Sure. Yes.
Yeah. So do you want to circle back to the question you smiled about?
So, damn it, you still remember the question. No, I mean, the scenario is that the building scanner will likely be used for spotters and hunter-killer teams. I remember that in OUP we had a quite similar problem in relation to snipers who were attacking or threatening to attack civilians. And then the question was in the targeting process, especially during the discussions we had in the JITWIC, in the targeting working group, to what extent those buildings would be military objectives. And most nations were quite restrictive on defining or identifying those buildings as being legitimate military objectives, unless there would have been a pattern, a modus operandi where it is clear and unambiguous that those buildings will be used by the enemy. So we had a very cautious approach in OUP in relation to the same problem, but then again, as I said, for sniper attacks. So I would be very cautious in this particular case.
So, I want to open it up to questions after this last question to all of you. Rich said in his presentation, he spoke about what he believes is a disconnect between the legal equality of protection of civilian property with protection of civilian lives and operational practice. Would you both agree that instinctively you're going to be more cautious when you think there's a risk of harming human beings and there's a risk of harming property? I mean, so let me give you the hypothetical. The apartment building, we don't think there are any civilians in there. They're just the enemy forces are using it. So it's a civilian building that is being used for military advantage of the enemy, so it's a lawful military objective. Are you going to be thinking, well, I don't want to attack it because I might damage the building?
It's night and day. If there are civilians in that building, then that is a difference. If there's just enemy forces in there and you're sure of that, then the building's coming down. I mean, there's not even I can't remember or heard of a case.
And if there's an empty building next door that's not being used by the enemy, that's also going to have to come down.
Maybe. Yeah, but there's no equality between the two that I can see.
I think most people are shocked when they look at Article 57, Article 51 in Additional Protocol 1, and they see that the precautions don't provide any distinction between human life and just property. It's surprising for people to see that, but what happens in practice is just what the general said. We always value life over property.
And there's a practical military reason for that. If it's an insurgency, you're not going to destroy as much of the infrastructure as you can just because you can. You're going to try to preserve it because it's again about getting the support of the population. And in this scenario, it's in friendly territory. These are friendlies, so you're going to be very precise in the application of force. You're not going to just destroy infrastructure without some regard for that.
On the issue of precision, what's your take on whether or not you think there's an obligation to use precision attack if it's available?
Absolutely.
Or do you consider long-range resupply and husbanding some of those assets for future operations?
Not in my experience, we've never had to do that.
So if you've got it, that's the priority.
Use it. That's right.
So I think
at one point over Baghdad, we had 6 Predators circling, and they were armed and ready to go, and we were able to do that. Now, if it were a larger conflict or another time, that would be a consideration, but not my experience.
Jeff, can I ask a general question for the benefit of the group? A gentleman here in the first row asked me a question. He observed that when I was speaking, and then I think out in the getting coffee, that I was jumping from the tactical through the operational to the strategic back and forth. And maybe that's confusing. But my response to that, and the question to the general is that, sir, don't you think that commanders now, and especially this has been highlighted in recent operations, are required to think and jump back from thinking about, okay, this is a tactical operation with a potentially, especially if we do it wrong, strategic impact, which is negative?
No, absolutely. Every commander at every level, every trooper's got to understand the operational or strategic impact of his actions. So taking the time to explain the purpose and having them understand, that's why it goes back to our training, understand culture and the overall mission is absolutely essential. Yeah, they're inextricably linked in these asymmetric environments in which we've operated the last 10 years.
So I think you all will recognize that we have some amazing experience in the application of the law. I know we also have some great experience in operational law in the audience. I want to use the last 10 or 15 minutes to open it up to questions, so we'll start there.
In terms of precision-guided munitions, there were two comments in there today. One was the general said, if we could use them if they're available, we should. Someone else said, well, if we look at the entire war and we might need to use it later, so then maybe we can. Do you think that might also be a different calculation for, say, a more rich military like the United States versus Israel, which I know when they use certain weapons, they have more limitation. And the other question I have is in terms of intelligence, most of the time intelligence doesn't make errors, and it's not in the newspapers, we don't hear about it. Is there a point after intelligence has made an error of a certain scale where you might look at it with a more critical eye?
So the first question is, do you think that reaction to that question is impacted by your sense that there's a fairly abundant supply of these capabilities?
Sure, absolutely. But I think the principle is you're going to be as precise as you can with your fires or engagements as possible as a principle. And if you have the means, you use the most precise means at your disposal. And you're not always going to have a precision-guided munition. But that's a factor. If you don't have it, then do you engage the target, or you wait for another day, another opportunity? That's a decision you have to make. As far as intelligence, best intelligence in these asymmetric scenarios is bottom up. I mean, from talking to the commanders on the ground, the troopers who are living within the population, they know what's going on. So I always erred on listening to the subordinates and their assessment versus some satellite shot or some analysis from Washington or something like that.
But I would assume you would become more either critical or demanding on the J2 if there had been a couple of failures.
Yeah, oh, absolutely, yeah.
And I think, I find it interesting, by the way, that I think it was Marco who made the comment that I don't believe there's an obligation to use precision-guided munitions if you're looking at the long-term operation and you're considering supply rates. But I think if we were to presuppose that there was a relatively unlimited supply of that capability, then it would change the equation significantly.
In 92 and 93, in the aftermath of Operation Desert Storm, where the United States used a lot of precision-guided munitions, there was a lot of academic activity in terms of the bifurcation issue. And the bifurcation issue was, recognize what you said, comparing a nation like Israel with the United States having greater capacity and having a greater supplies, at least theoretically, of these weapons. And so, do you have a higher standard, a different standard for the larger and rich nation states with a bigger military than the nation states that may have very few, if any, PGMs? So if you have no PGMs, you have no obligation. So different standard. And the academic community actually wrote an article on this in '93. The response of the academic community was no, it's the same standard. Regardless of where you find yourself in that spectrum, there's only one standard.
Yeah, and I hope everybody recognized what I thought was a pretty important moment just then. General Barbero's emphasis on you always want to be as precise as you can be because of tactical and operational effect, correct?
Absolutely.
Not just because of law.
Right, absolutely. And I would tell you that the intelligence question and targeting is an hourly, daily event. One time in the height of a really tough period, we were having nightly targeting meetings. And so how do you coordinate targeting between different agencies that have different authorities? We had our intelligence agencies. They had different authorities on what they could do. You had indigenous forces. They had different authorities, different capabilities. And then our own special operations forces and then conventional forces. And as I said, they had different authorities and certainly in the case of the indigenous forces, different legal restrictions and authorities. So how do you merge that and come out with a coherent rules of engagement and targeting list? And for about a 10-day period, we'd have that meeting at night, and every morning I'd go to the commander, General Petraeus, say, sir, here's the revision to our targeting list and our rules of engagement that I recommend you adopt. So it's very dynamic, and the operational law, the intelligence, and it has to be assessed continuously.
Yes, sir.
I have a question to all the three panelists with respect to the role of the legal advisor in targeting operations. My question is, who gets to make the decision, both with respect to the principle of distinction and with respect to the principle of proportionality? Is it the commander, the military commander, or the legal advisor? On the question of distinction, when the question is whether a certain target is a military target, is the final call the call of the legal advisor or of the commander? And on proportionality, what is the involvement of the legal advisor, if at all, in the analysis of whether a specific use of weapons will be proportionate in the circumstances?
It's the commander. How many legal advisors are in court being tried? I mean,
the legal advisor gets to make the decision on what advice he gives the commander.
the commander's got the ultimate responsibility and is the one who's held accountable. So
I mean,
he makes the call.
I think, from my own experience, I think the way most military legal advisors are trained is that that's kind of pounded into them, that you are advising, but ultimately the responsibility for making that judgment rests with the operational commander. I mean, are there commanders who would prefer to shift that off? I would hope not.
I don't think so.
So there can be situations that the legal advisor will say, well, I don't think this target is actually a military target, and it will still be for the commander to make the decision if it is his view that notwithstanding the legal advice, the target is a military target.
I think absolutely. Now, I think from a lawyer's perspective, that raises a certain ethical dimension, okay? At some point, are you obligated to tell your commander, sir, I disagree with you, I think what you're doing is illegal, and I have to go to my supervisor and who will maybe go to your supervisor and relook it. We're taught in the American Army that our client is not the commander, our client is the nation, right? So the commander is the embodiment of the client in an operation, but we are taught that we may reach a point where we have to say to the commander, yes, you get to make that judgment, but I think you're making an illegal judgment, and my duty to the nation is to elevate it. But go ahead, Rich.
I've personally pushed back on a number of occasions to commanders that I have very high regard for, and pushed back very hard. And usually when there's a difference of opinion, I almost always did that privately with the commander. And the question was, from the commander, is why do you feel that way? Explain why you disagree with me. And so I was knowing that would be the question, I was always prepared in detail to answer that question. So I mean, and I never had the situation where I had to go through my technical chain, the next higher lawyer up, the advises the next higher commander up. I never had that happen. But I mean, I have had situations where I did push back.
Chris?
What may happen sometimes is that we work on a national level. You work with in a coalition. You work with red card holders at the RCH, and it happens sometimes that your RCH is, let's say, encouraged to participate in this part of the campaign or that part of the campaign, and that finally your RCH would like to have another legal opinion from the same legal advisor, trying to change the legal advice. And in which case, as a legal advisor, I mean, you have to stand up because you make an assessment on what is your legal opinion on a military objective, on proportionality, etc., based on the information available at that time and based on the knowledge you have then. But that may not influence your legal advice as well. But at the end of the day, it's the commander who takes the decision and who takes the responsibility for the decisions he's taking. And the legal advisor, as it says, it's an advisor, such as the POLAD, the cultural advisor, and whatever advisor you may have. But the ultimate responsibility and authority and responsibility rests with the commander, full stop.
But having said that, I'll add one more point, and I think the general would agree with me, that the commanders do not want lawyers who won't speak up. They don't want lawyers that will, when the commander says, no, we're going to do it, we're going to go in X direction. Even if the lawyer thinks there's something wrong with that, he just says, well, the commander's made his decision, I'm not going to say anything. That's not the type of lawyer that commanders want. Commanders want lawyers who will speak up and explain why they think that that might not be the best course. That doesn't mean that they're going to change their mind, because the lawyer doesn't know everything. The commander knows a great deal more operationally than the lawyer knows. There's other factors that factor in, but the lawyer is expected to stand up and explain why he thinks that might not be the best course.
Although it does circle back in a sense to where the general started in his opening remarks, which is the law has to evolve to continue to reflect that, to be relevant. Because if the law becomes, in my view, I think the reason that historically this is not a big problem is because the law is relevant and has developed to recognize the realities of war, and therefore when it's explained in that sense, you have a commander who says, okay, what I'm proposing to do I can see will ultimately not just be legally wrong but operationally counterproductive. But if the law and that reality become too attenuated, then you're going to have this difficult situation where the lawyers are going to be saying you're not allowed to do this, and the commander is going to say this makes no sense.
Right, absolutely.
Chris?
And again, your legal advisor, I mean, he's not working in a vacuum as well. I mean, he's doing a job for his commander or for the nation in the bigger picture. So he needs to have the situational awareness, the operational situational awareness as well, in order to make a correct legal assessment based on the intelligence and what exactly are the plans of the commander.
Can you just comment on the proportionality part of it? Do lawyers make proportionality assessments at all, or is it just the commanders that make it proportionality?
We make assessments, very detailed assessments, but again, that information is provided to the commander in the form of advice.
Okay, I've been instructed by Commander Daphné Richemond-Barak, who is one commander you never disobey, but I've got 5 minutes. So, yes.
I would ask you about the joint operation. Do you think that the national caveat would be an obstacle to operations or not? For the other countries, of course.
As a commander, national caveats are a huge obstacle. You're talking about as part of a coalition force. Certain countries have national caveats. Well, their forces are not allowed to do this or that. So it's a huge issue. But it's something you have to reconcile and figure out, okay, how can I use them and what role to do which actions. It's the nature of today's coalition warfare. You just have to deal with it. It's a reality.
Yes, sir, in the back.
I recently talked to a general in the Israeli army. He's retired as a reserve. And I said, well, look, we're trying to save money in the country. So why don't they bring in a civilian body to advise the generals and whatever how to save money? Which kind of made sense. And so we got into an argument. He said, like, the goal of the military officer is to win the war, not to be an economic officer. Do all these calculations. So how do you see, like, as a commander, has this made it more difficult for you because of the legal advisors? Like now that you have all these different considerations?
Is it more to make
To make the jobs
Is your job harder? Is your job of accomplishing the operational mission more difficult because lawyers are harassing you all the time?
No. It's a very complex decision, and the lawyers are part of that. Do you have the intelligence? Do you have the means to do it? Is it legal, or is there? I'd turn to the lawyer and say, well, tell me what I can do, or tell me how to do this. Okay, you're saying I can't use this against this target. Well, tell me what I can do. You understand the mission. You've been born and raised in the same military as I have. Tell me, get me to yes. How can I do this? So
How
I think
would you?
if you're mentioning bringing in civilians to do that, I'm married to a civilian. I love them, but they would not have the same understanding of the context. So.
No. So you feel there's value in having the lawyer be inculcated in the military culture.
It's essential, absolutely. They understand the mission. They understand what you're trying to accomplish, the risk, and it's absolutely essential.
One more? Yes, sir. That's okay.
attention to the other side of the scale, which is the civilian damage. And I want to bug you a bit about that. Let's say the situation is that you know that if you attack now the air defense, 1,000 civilians will die, but you have with complete certainty you neutralize the enemy air facility. If you warn them, there's the chance that they'll protect themselves, move some of the equipment to another place, but only 500 civilians will die. Or you can send a special ops operation. Maybe they'll succeed to neutralize the command of that defense system, and one civilian will die. This is the situation. What would you choose in that extremely simplified?
Yeah. Well, another factor in this case is this is Southland, and you're operating as part of a coalition. So the Southland authorities, is it Southland? Good guys, yeah. Southland authorities would have a key role in this. Saying we're not going to tolerate, we're not going to accept this level of destruction of this village or these level of casualties. So it gets to the question about national caveats. How do you, as a commander, take all of these different factors to include from your legal advisor and make a decision? Some decisions. I remember going to in Iraq, a certain type of target, dealing with individuals from a country to our east in Iraq, had to have the ambassador's approval. Even though General Petraeus approved it, Washington approved it, I went to see Ambassador Crocker and I said, "Here's the intel we have." He said, "Good hunting." So it's not black and white. It's not just full. Let's level this village. You have to. Every question, every environment's unique. Whether it's with a coalition, your own ambassador, or some other factor that you have to weigh before you make these decisions.
Well, and again, we can take up some of this at lunch. I think that's a great question because it does kind of raise the question, is there some top limit that becomes presumptively excessive, right? 1,000 civilians for any operation. I think most commanders would say we got to figure out some other way. But so I'll turn it over to Daphné so she can give us the directions. And thank you very much, and please thank the panel.
Thank you all very much. There is a beautiful lunch which is awaiting us and all of you in the building next door. Please follow us, and we will reconvene in about 5 minutes. Thank you all.
Thank you very much. Thanks. Thank you. Thanks.
I don't want to say
The best one. It's the best one. It's just the best one.